be with you guys. How's it going? You guys surviving or are you thriving? How many of you would say, I'm just surviving right now? Dude, I'm just surviving out there. Anybody thriving? Couple of you? Okay. Come tell us later how you're doing it. Give us the secret. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors around here. So thankful to be able to share with you guys, always to take us into something that I think God's got for us. We're in this series called... I was almost good. We're in this series called Genesis in the Beginning. It's really probably mostly called In the Beginning, but we're studying the book of Genesis. This is the last week of this series. How many of you have been reading in the book of Genesis? Even just a little bit, if you've kind of tried to dive into it. We've challenged you to really dive in. We're so proud of you guys for diving into the book of Genesis and reading along. And we're going to kind of go to the end of the book today. And to get us started, I've got a couple things I want you to think about, maybe just to help our minds get moving in the right direction. In fact, I'm going to throw out something to you. It's going to be a type of person, and here's what I want you to do. If this type of person, when I throw out whatever type of person it is, if someone immediately comes to your mind, would you just raise your hand? That's all I want you to do. And if no one comes to your mind, just don't raise your hand. Do you think you could do that? Simple. If you're like, oh, I know someone like that, for sure, right away, okay? I'll give you a couple easy ones. Maybe most of you will raise your hand. Here we go. Okay. Who comes to your mind when you think of the funniest person you know? Somebody come to your mind right away? Anybody? Funniest person you know? I definitely know who that is in my life. Okay, all right. Most of you have a funny person in your life. Somebody who makes you laugh. That's good. How about who comes to your mind when you think of the smartest person you know? That person that always gets such a good grade. Got some people like that in your life? Okay, all right. Let me give you maybe a little bit more difficult one. Who comes to mind when you think of the hardest working person you know? Might be a little more of a challenge. You have somebody, some of you a specific person. It's okay if nobody comes to your mind. A specific person? Okay. Who comes to mind when you think of the nicest person that you know? Okay, a lot of hands on that one. Not many hands on this section. Not a lot of nice people over here. Is that what's going on? Is this the not so nice people section? Is that what's happening over here to the right? How many of you would say the nicest person I know is sitting right next to me? No, I'm just kidding. Don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand, because if you don't raise your hand, you're in trouble, and they're going to make them feel like, what did I do wrong? How about this one? Who comes to your mind? Does someone come to your mind when you think of the loudest person you know? Okay, you can raise your hand for this one. How many of you would say the loudest person you know is sitting right next to you? Are they here? Are they next to you? How many of you know you are the loudest person some people know? You know that's you. You just want to own it. Loudest person out there. Love it. Good. All right. Let me shift gears with you for a second, okay? We're going to bring it into a more serious zone. And I know it's going to be a hard shift. It's going to feel sudden. But I'm going to throw out two more. But for these two, I really do not want you to raise your hand. I actually just want you to think about it. Don't raise your hand. Even if somebody instantly comes to your mind, I just want you to think, who comes to your mind when you think of the most difficult person you know? Don't raise your hand. Who comes to your mind when you think of the most hurtful person that you know? And I think a sad truth that we have to own tonight is that for almost everybody in this room, somebody came to your mind for those last two. It's sad to think about it, but everybody in the world has a difficult person. Everybody has somebody who's hurtful to them. And as we end the book of Genesis, we read about a young man named Joseph. Maybe some of you have read about Joseph already as you've been doing your time alone with God, but Joseph's story is amazing. And there's so many good lessons to learn, but one of the most important, I think, in Joseph's story is the fact that Joseph was a man who had some incredibly difficult people. Joseph was a man who had some incredibly hurtful people. And actually, before I tell you his story, I want to tell you a little bit about mine. Now, I know that some of you may know my story a little bit, but when somebody would ask me, who, Brad, is the most difficult person that you know? Who's the most hurtful person that you know? For me, it's the same person. And I'll just be honest with you, that person for me is my dad. And I know it's sad to say that, but my dad has always been, since I can remember, my most difficult person. My dad's always been the most hurtful person in my life. Now, my dad passed away about 8 years ago, But throughout my life, there was so much pain and so much difficulty. My dad had a huge issue in his life. He was an alcoholic. And so ever since I can remember, my dad's life has revolved around drinking and alcohol. And because of that, there have been so many tough things that I've been through that I wouldn't wish upon anybody in this world. I remember growing up and just wishing that my dad would come see me, wishing my dad would spend time with me. My mom and my dad divorced when I was about 2, and there were times when my dad would pick me up from my home as a little kid, and then he would take me to the back parking lot of the bar, and he would lock me in his truck for hours while he went into the bar to drink. And then he would come out and drive drunk to wherever we were going. There were times where my dad would tell me he was going to come pick me up, and then he just wouldn't show. I remember as a little kid, I would wait by my kitchen window, and I would make up a number in my mind, and I would say, after that many cars, my dad's going to come. And I would count that many cars, and then my dad wouldn't show up, and then I would just make up a new number, and I would just want my dad to come and be with me. I remember wishing that my dad would come to my baseball games and my football games. I remember just wishing he would be a part of my life, and so many times getting a call from him telling me he wanted to spend time with me, and then he just wouldn't show up at all. And I remember honestly thinking, like, what's wrong with me? Like, did I do something? Is there something wrong that he doesn't love me? There were lots of times, especially I would say about when I was in middle school, where my dad would bring me to his house, and then he would come home like on a Friday night, Saturday morning at 4 a.m., like when the bar closed, and he and his girlfriend would fight. And they would punch each other and scream at each other and yell at each other, and I would get caught up in that. And I would dread it because my dad would always leave, and he would take me with him, and I would have to spend the rest of the night in my dad's truck. And that's where I would sleep for the night. And there are just moments like that I just look back and I think I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. But I had to grow up with that my whole life. Those questions, that hurt, that pain. And I know for the vast majority of you here tonight, whoever it is that comes to your mind, your most difficult person, it's probably not nearly that bad or not nearly that serious. But I think we're all left wondering with the people in our lives that are difficult, the people in our lives that do hurt us. We wonder, like, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to navigate that? What am I supposed to say to that person? And I think if you know God and you're trying to follow Jesus, you probably find yourself asking this question. Like, when it comes to the most difficult and hurtful people, God, what do you want me to do? With the most hurtful and the most difficult, what does God want us to do? And I think the story of Joseph actually gives us some huge help when it comes to this part of our lives. You see, in the Bible, Joseph's story starts around Genesis chapter 37, and it gets interesting almost right away. Joseph is the 11th of 12 sons, and it says almost right at the beginning, in fact, it says in Genesis 37:3 that Joseph's dad loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Joseph was clearly his favorite. And then it says in verse 4 that his brothers hated him. They detested him. And so imagine this, Joseph, it says he's 17 years old. In fact, keep that in mind. Joseph's 17 years old. And it says his brothers hate him. He's his dad's favorite. In fact, his dad makes him this like special robe, this special coat for him, this beautiful coat. And his brothers, all his life, have hated him. Imagine being this younger brother that's been mistreated, that's been hated on, that's been disliked by almost your whole family. That's what Joseph has had to grow up with. And he's 17 years old, and all of a sudden, he has a dream that he realizes is from God. And in his dream, it says that, it shows like these symbolic figures that Joseph knows are his other brothers, and it shows them bowing down to him. And if I'm Joseph, I'm just like, thank you, God. Finally, I have some hope here. Like, finally, there's going to be some justice. He even goes to his brothers, and he's like, hey, someday you all are going to bow down to me. Like, that's probably what I would do if I was him, if I had been mistreated my whole life, if I had been hated my whole life by almost my whole family. And finally, God gave me some relief and said, hey, someday they're going to bow down to you. I'd probably say that too. And Joseph says this to his brothers, and you know what his brothers do? They decide they're going to kill him. They make up this plan. They're going to take his life. One of his brothers like, no, let's not kill him. Let's actually just like sell him as a slave. So Joseph gets like thrown in this pit and then sold as a slave. He becomes a slave of an Egyptian official for a while. And while he's a slave, he's falsely accused of something he didn't do, and then he's thrown in prison. And then if you fast forward into the Genesis like chapter 41, you find it says when Joseph was 30 years old. Now, I'll stop there because if he was 17 when he got sold as a slave and now he's 30, how many years have passed? 13 years. He's either been a slave or he's been in prison for 13 years. It says when he was 30 that Pharaoh had this weird dream. And Joseph has got this reputation by now. Like he can interpret dreams. And it's gotten to Pharaoh, word's gotten out. There's this guy in your prison. He can interpret your dreams. So Pharaoh gets Joseph and has Joseph come before him. He says, hey, tell me what my dream means. And Joseph lays out for Pharaoh, like, this is what your dream means. In Egypt and all across the land, there's going to be 7 years of what Joseph calls great abundance. Meaning there's going to be tons of food, Pharaoh, like so much food you won't know what to do with it. And then the 7 years after that, there's going to be a famine, like no food. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of his whole kingdom. Joseph, for 7 years, begins to store all the extra food in the land. He begins to come up with this plan to keep this food and save this food and prepare for this famine. So 7 more years go by. Okay, now how many years have gone by? 13 plus 7 is? Man, some of you are surviving and you're not thriving in math right now. You know what I'm saying? It's 20 years have gone by. Then it says year 2 of the famine, something happens. Now how many years? 22. In year 2 of this great famine, Joseph's whole family begins to starve. And they hear that there's food in Egypt. And so they go to Egypt. His 10 older brothers go to Egypt. And they appear before the great Egyptian governor. They don't know who this guy is. This guy who's about, 39 years old. And this governor, they appear before him, and it's Joseph. It's their brother. They have no idea. And you might think, like, in a Bible story, 22 years have gone by. Joseph's grown up a lot. He's gotten a lot more mature. He's probably, gotten over this, and he's going to throw his arms around his brother and, hug them and, take care of them, and it's going to be good. And Joseph's he's matured in his faith, you know? But do you want to see how Joseph actually responds to his brothers? Let me show you. Let me take you into Genesis chapter 42. Starting in verse 6, it says that Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. A few verses later, it says that Joseph put them all in custody for 3 days. And then at the end of the chapter, it says this: Joseph turned away from them and began to weep. I found this so fascinating. 22 years later, Joseph sees these brothers, and he does what? He speaks harshly to them. He falsely accuses them. He was falsely accused in Egypt. Why not falsely accuse his brothers? Why not do the same thing back to them that they caused to happen to him? Then he ends up just throwing them in prison, like, get them away from me. I don't want them in my life. I don't want them to be a part of my story. I want them out of here. I want to put some distance between me and them. Joseph's mad at them. I mean, he is mad. But what maybe hits home the most is that 22 years later, Joseph is still hurting. 22 years later, it still breaks his heart. And I just want to ask you tonight, when it comes to the difficult person in your life, even if it's just something minor, maybe it's not this bad, but do you find yourself in this same place? Do you find yourself being harsh with them? Do you find yourself cutting them down? Maybe even saying things about them that aren't quite true? Do you find yourself just wanting them out of your life? Joseph throws them in prison. I don't know where you and I are throwing them, but we just want them out. And ultimately, maybe some of you can relate with finding yourself still hurting. still feeling like your heart is broken over whatever it is that's happening in that relationship. And if you know God, or if you're learning to know God, or maybe you're wanting to know who God is, you're probably finding yourself as you think about this person saying, God, what do I do about that? God, when it comes to the most difficult and hurtful people in my life, what am I supposed to do? And what I want to do tonight is I just want to give you 3 simple steps you can take if you ever have somebody in your life that hurts you, somebody in your life that's hard for you. You know the first thing I think we can do? I believe that we can just stop and we can start by seeing them through God's eyes. By looking at them and saying, God, when you see them, what do you see? I remember one time when I was in high school, I was reading in Luke chapter 5. I came across this passage where some people asked Jesus, they're like, Jesus, why do you hang out with these bad people? Like, Jesus, you're eating dinner with these tax collectors. These people are stealing from the Jews. Why are you eating with them? Why are you hanging out with them? And Jesus says in verse 31, he says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. And I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And I read that, and this may sound weird to you guys, but there are times in my life where God will speak to me through like a picture. I can't hardly explain it. It's like I'll see something in my mind and I'll know that it's from God and I'll know he's speaking to me. And I remember as I read that passage, still to this day, I remember seeing my dad. And I remember my dad was laying on his couch in his living room and he was covered with a blanket and he was shivering and he had like a runny nose and he was coughing and he was sweating. And it looked like my dad was so sick. And I remember sensing in my heart, my Father in heaven saying, Brad, when I see your dad, that's what I see. Brad, your dad is so spiritually sick. And he can't even love you even if he wanted to try. And I remember for the first time in my life feeling some compassion for my dad. It says in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And when you get to Genesis chapter 45, in fact, if you look right at the beginning of Genesis 45, it says that Joseph couldn't take it anymore. And he decided to change his approach. And you know the first thing Joseph did when he flipped his approach to his brothers? It just says this in Genesis 45, verse 4. It says, Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. It's as if Joseph began to see them in a different light. He began to bring them back into his life. Joseph's heart began to be filled with compassion. And I think for some of us, the place we need to begin is we need to say, God, help me to see what you see when you see that person. As we do that, I think the next step God would lead us to take is not just to see them through his eyes, but also to tell ourselves a different story. You see, in life, when something happens to you, there's almost always the same sequence of events. In fact, I'll put them up on the screen. Maybe you can relate to this. You experience something, you feel something, and you respond. This is pretty much anything in life. You see what I'm talking about? Like, let's take that difficult or hurtful person. You experience whatever it is that they do that frustrates you. You feel something, and then you respond. But I want to tell you that there's actually something that happens in the middle of that we almost never realize. The reason we don't realize it's happening is because you and I are so good at it, it happens instantly. Like we don't even know because it happens so fast. We actually experience something, but before we feel, we tell a story. You see, before we feel anything, we actually, almost instantly in our minds, fill in the gaps that we don't know with whatever it is that person did. Almost instantly when somebody treats us in a certain way, we tell a story about that person's intentions even though we don't actually know. Like, you know a good test for this? If you drive or you're with someone that drives, have you ever seen someone get angry while they're driving? Like, have you ever been with someone or you've been that someone who's been cut off when you're on the road? And you know what happens when you get cut off? You experience that and you feel what? You feel angry. And then you say in your heart, like, what a selfish person. Like, that person is so inconsiderate. But you know what you did? You actually told yourself a story of a selfish, inconsiderate person that didn't care about you. When in reality, you have no idea why they cut you off. But you tell a story. There's a lot of times in my life, there's a stoplight right by the office where I work at. And I'll get behind somebody at the light, and the light will turn green, and then they won't go because it's kind of a long light. It's right across from Pine Valley by the McDonald's there. And I'll wait at that stoplight, and I say to myself, like, when do I honk at them? You know, like, when is it okay when are you still a nice person, but you can honk, you know? Like, how many of you, it's like 1 second? You give them 1 second, and then you honk at them. I remember one time I was with my wife, and that happened to her. We were at a stoplight, and the person in front of her didn't go, and she, like, honked so harshly at them. And I was like, honey, you know there are, like, 2 different kind of honks. Like, one kind of honk's just a gentle tap on the horn, you know, like it's just a little beep, and it's like, hey, just telling you the light is green. And then there's the kind of honk that you just did, which is the mean honk. And my wife looks at me and she goes, well, I only know one kind of honk, and my honk says, yo, get it together. I remember one day I was sitting in my office years ago, and my mom called me. And she said, hey, Brad, your stepdad just took his own life today. She lost her husband. He committed suicide. And I got in my car to go be with her. And I went out to that same light, and I was first in line, and the light turned green, and I didn't see it. And someone behind me honked, and then I saw it, and then I went. And you know what? They didn't know my story. And the truth is, there are some people in our lives who are hurting us and who are difficult for us. But you know what they need us to do? They need us to tell ourselves a different story. They need us to give them the benefit of the doubt. Look what Joseph does in Genesis chapter 45. It says in verse 5, Joseph says to his brothers, he says, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to save your lives by a great deliverance. Joseph stops and he begins to see them through God's eyes, and then he tells himself a different story. Joseph recognizes that there's more going on around him than what he realized at first, that there are things that God's doing or things happening that he didn't know about. And he chose to tell himself a different story. And you can do that too. And the last thing I'll give you is just to remember how much Jesus has forgiven you. You see, Joseph in Genesis 45, the thing that ultimately made the difference for him with the hardest people in his life is he simply began to remember all that God had done for him. It says in Genesis 45, verse 8, so then Joseph says, it was not you that sent me here, but God. God made me father to Pharaoh. He made me lord of his entire household. He made me ruler of all of Egypt. Joseph began to just remember what his father had done for him. And he began to set his heart and his eyes on God instead of on his difficult people. And you know, we need to pause sometimes and just remember, you know who was difficult for God? Do you know who hurt God's heart? When he rejected God and he often turned his back on God. Do you know who it is that claims to know Jesus Christ and yet still disobeys his Father in heaven? It's me. And yet my God still forgives me, and he still loves me. And when I remember all the love that he has for me and all the forgiveness that he's given me, when I set my eyes on him, the person who's hurtful for me, the person who's difficult to me, begins to be someone that I can love too. I remember when I was in college, my dad called me over Christmas break. And he just asked me, he said, hey, Brad, would you come spend Christmas Day with me? And at that point in my life, my dad was someone I had kind of pushed away from me. He was someone I didn't really want to be in my life. And yet I was growing in my faith, and I was starting to really know Jesus. And I thought about it, and I thought, I've got better things that I could do for Christmas, for sure. I've got a wonderful girlfriend, a girl I would eventually marry. I've got my mom, who I could spend Christmas Day with. I could be with my girlfriend's family, my mom. I could hang with my friends. But you know what? I'm going to go hang with my dad on Christmas Day. So I told him, I said, yeah, Dad, I'll come over. I'll come hang out with you. So I remember Christmas morning came, and I got up, and I drove over to his house. He lived about an hour from me. And I was a poor college kid, so it wasn't exactly an easy decision to pay for all that gas to go see my dad. But I remember I got to my dad's house. It was maybe 11 a.m. or so in the morning, and I pulled in, and I noticed right away his car wasn't there. And I went up to the door, and the door was locked. And I knew right away my dad wasn't here. And I don't know if you've ever had somebody who hides the key to their house under a mat or a rock, but I knew where the key was to my dad's house, so I got his key out, and I unlocked the door, and I went in, and I called him, and he didn't answer. And so I waited for a little bit, called him again, no answer. And I just sat there, and I thought to myself, no way that my dad's going to do this to me on Christmas Day when I came all the way over here to be with him. And I decided I'm going to wait him out. So I waited for a little while, turned on the TV, called him again, no answer. Called him several times, no answer. I waited in my dad's living room that day for, I think, 8 hours alone. Finally, it was 7 o'clock at night. I hadn't eaten anything, I was hungry. And it was dark, and I decided to go home. So I went out and I got in my car, and I pulled out on the road by his subdivision, and then I went out to the highway to go home. And at the intersection of that road and the highway is a gas station, and I look over as I'm pulling up to the stoplight, and my dad's van is at the gas station. So I pull in, and I park, and I walk over to my dad, and I'm like, Dad, where have you been? I've been waiting for you all day. And he goes, I ran out of gas. And I knew the truth. I knew that again, my dad chose to go drink instead of be with me on Christmas Day. And he probably was driving by his house waiting for me to leave on that day. And he did run out of gas. And I looked at him, and I just said that day, I said, okay, Dad, I'll fill up your gas tank. And he goes, you don't have to do that. And I was like, no, it's okay, Dad. So I got the pump out and started putting gas in his van. He had this work van. It was a 35-gallon gas tank. And back then, gas was cheap. It was $2 a gallon, but I put $70 worth of gas in my dad's van that Christmas Day. My dad was milling around over by the gas station, and he came over about halfway through me putting gas in his van. He's like, that's enough. And I'm like, no, it's okay, Dad. I'll fill up your tank. And I finished filling it up, and I walked over to him, and I just hugged him. And I said, Merry Christmas, Dad, I love you. And my dad began to cry on my shoulders. And I remember that Christmas night, holding my dad and him crying on my shoulder, and realizing in my heart that there's no other way for anything to ever change in this relationship. I mean, if I just give my dad back what he deserves, and if I treat him how he treated me, and if I continue to be harsh with him, and if I continue to cut into him, and if I continue to push him away, it's never gonna change. The only thing that'll ever change this is if someone decides to love my dad even when he doesn't deserve it. And as I held him and as he cried, I realized for just a few moments, I got to be Jesus to my dad, because that's what Jesus did for me. That when I was so unlovable, he wrapped his arms around me and he said, Brad, I love you. And I want you to know today that there is hope even in your most difficult relationship. That there is hope for change. And it doesn't come through being harsh and angry and the hurt that you feel and the pain that's accumulated. That your Father in heaven, he can break through that, and he can do it through you. And he can do it as you see them through God's eyes, and as you tell yourself a different story, and as you just remember how much he loves you. And then you go to them and you give them that same love. And as you love them like that, this world will change, and this world will be different. And people will see that there is a God who can make all the difference, who can set a new path, and who can restore a generation, who can save a kingdom, who can raise up a nation out of the pits of a famine, as he did through Joseph. He can can do through you. And I challenge you, Impact. You go from this place and you love even the most difficult people in your life, and you watch what God will do through you. Let me pray for you. Jesus, would you give us the strength from this place, from this moment, to go and live this out? God, would you show us specifically and clearly the changes that we need to make, the ways that we can go and be different and make a difference. And I pray, Father in heaven, that you'd continue to wrap your arms around the one who's here tonight, who's hurting so bad, that you'd remind them of how much you love them, and that you would remind them that there's hope for them, and that you would do a restoring, cleansing, building work where everything feels broken. God, I know you can. I pray that you would. In Jesus' name, amen.